Hey friends and filmmakers, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm gonna share with you the best settings for filming video on your DSLR. So you've got a nice, brand new, shiny DSLR. It might look like this, or maybe this. To be honest with you, all of these cameras produce pretty impressive results with everything set to auto. But if you want to bring your video skills to the next level and really make your videos look all that much more professional, then it's important that you throw that thing into manual and start playing around with the settings and learn what works best. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is go into your camera settings and change everything over from automatic exposure to manual exposure. Every camera is going to be different. For mine, it's as easy as switching the scroll wheel over from A to M. But if you're using a Canon Rebel series, if it's the same as it was back when I had one, then you're gonna need to go into the video settings specifically and change the exposure over from auto to manual. Before we venture further into exposure, let's talk a little bit about frame rate. Frame rate is about the number of frames per second in your video. I personally like to film in 60 frames per second because that way later on, I can edit it into 30 frames per second and have really nice, smooth, slow motion. But if your camera doesn't go up to 60 frames per second, then 30 is just fine for most videos. I wouldn't really recommend ever shooting in 60 frames per second and then exporting in 60 frames per second. I personally just don't like the look of it. It looks like it's faster than real life. It's a little unnatural. I think that it's pretty universally agreed upon that 30 or 24 frames per second is the most natural looking frame rate for video. The next setting you want to change on your DSLR is white balance. This is something that is really going to depend on the circumstance that you're in. Honestly, for the most part, auto white balance on new cameras works really well at choosing what the white balance should be for the situation. But there's lots of different presets that you can work with depending on your situation. If it's cloudy outside, if it's sunny, if there's tungsten light, etc., etc. So depending on the room that you're in, you'll want to play around with the white balance setting. Now let's move on to arguably the most important part of your video settings on your DSLR, and that is exposure. I have an entire video about how to shoot in manual, and it goes into the kind of in-depth details of what exposure is made up of, how all the different features work. But for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna run you through my kind of best go-to settings that will be a starting point for you for shooting in manual on your camera. If you haven't heard of exposure before, it is made up of 3 elements, aka the exposure triangle. We have aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. A general rule in filmmaking is that your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So if you're shooting in 60 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be 1/120. If your camera only goes up to 30 frames per second, then you should do 1/60 for your shutter speed. Having this ratio right means that the video will have the kind of correct amount of motion blur so that it looks natural to the eye. Moving on to aperture, this one can really depend based on your stylistic choices, but in general, if you want to get a really professional looking image, it's nice to have a low aperture that creates a little bit of a blurry background. It makes your subject stand out from the background, and it's something that a lot of point and shoots and some phones can't replicate, so it makes you look like you're using a fancy camera. But actually though, it does just look really nice if you have a crisp subject and a bit of a blurry background. But depending on the kind of mood or story that you're trying to communicate, you might want to use a higher aperture so that the entire scene is in focus. This is also going to change how bright your image is. For most settings, it's nice to have a wide open aperture because it means that you're getting all the light that you need onto that sensor so that your image can be nicely exposed. Finally, the basics of ISO, the third point on the exposure triangle. For the most part, I would say keep your ISO as low as you can with the image still being bright enough. Right now, my ISO is literally like at 100, the lowest it can be because I'm in such a bright, well-lit room. But if you're somewhere darker and you need the image to be lighter, you can bring the ISO all the way up to like 800 or so before it's gonna start looking grainy. Depending on how good your camera is in low light, you can crank the ISO up pretty high before it starts to look bad, but in general, it's safe to keep it 800 or lower so that you can have like the cleanest image possible without any noise. So those are the beginner basics of the best settings for filming video on your DSLR. Let's recap. If you want to be able to make your video slow-mo, then make sure you shoot in 60 frames per second, otherwise choose 30. In general, you can let your camera do the work for the white balance, but if not, choose the setting that's best for your environment. Make your shutter speed double your frame rate, so 1/120 for 60 frames per second or 1/60 for 30 frames per second. Make your aperture as low as it can go for a nice shallow depth of field, or make it higher if you want the entire scene to be in focus. Make your ISO as low as it can go for the lighting situation that you're in, and try not to exceed 800 if you need to. So that's it for today's tutorial. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let me know in the comments below if this was useful for you. Make sure you smash that like button if you enjoyed it. Oh my gosh, I've never said that before, and I kind of hate myself. Please do let me know in the comments though if you'd be interested in a similar video like this, talking about the basics of slow motion and how to shoot it, how to edit slow motion, all that kind of thing. Of course, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already so that you don't miss any of my future videos. I love to talk about all things filmmaking and travel. As always, I love you all. I hope you're following your dreams, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.